see, when people speak, when I also speak about Western construction of Hinduism, Buddhism, and David Lawrenson has issued a challenge. But in a way, actually, he issued a challenge to all those who speak about the British construction or colonial construction to make good their case, because he has been able to talk about, he claims, justifiably so, people prior to the British colonization speaking about Hinduism in these terms. It has been my thesis all along that when people from religious cultures, I mean to say, people who are brought up in cultures which have religions, go to another culture to study the people, then it is my thesis that they're compelled to see religion and they're compelled to bring together discrete phenomena which do not belong together into a coherent unit. So when the Muslims came to India and colonized us, because there is such thing as Islamic colonialism, when the British came and colonized us, because there is some such thing called British colonialism, or when Europe, between the two periods, visited us and gave descriptions, these are all people who came from a religious culture. And what is it that they saw? They saw all kinds of things, of course. They saw certain kinds of behavior which they considered moral behavior. They saw certain acts which appeared to them as acts of reverence. They saw certain stories which they considered as cosmogonies, and so on and so forth. So they, in that sense, the Muslims less coherently, intellectually, less coherently than the Europeans did, both constructed in the following sense, namely, they made a unit. For example, to give you an idea of what kind of unit it is, for instance, this is my favorite example I use. Imagine that somebody from Mars were to come down to Earth. And he would say, he would see the Brahmins doing Sandhya Vandanam. He would see, I don't know, one man beating his wife, and somebody drinking water from a well, and so on. And he sees in them something, let's say, hip copy. He's a hip copy in it. So after that Martian, many million more come down, and they all keep on saying hip copies, hip copies. They see, oh, they have lots of hip copy. Yeah, they have hip copy. They understand each other. I presume that, and I'll shortly tell you why. So after a certain time, after certain currency, and after certain kinds of perhaps historical contingencies, like the Martians colonizing us, whatever, then hip copy to them would not only be a phenomenon, which is obviously there, but would also be an explanation of itself. So much so to ask what the hip copy is appears to be an expression of stupidity, if not senility. So in this sense, to ask today, what is Hinduism? Does it exist? Sounds very absurd. But actually it is not, because the units they have brought together are real. They do exist. Brahmins do Sandhya Vandanam. People do beat each other. People indeed draw water from the wells. But the point is this: they do not cohere together as a phenomenon in society or in culture. So construction merely means this, that two people who have religion, whether it's the West or the Muslims, it is obvious that all cultures have religion. It is in fact a fundamental claim of the theology. Imagine what would happen. In fact, there was such a historical period. Imagine what would happen were they to discover people without religions. For instance, it did happen so that for a period of time, for nearly a century long, when Europeans went to China, the Jesuits were the first who wrote consistently and with lots of material on it. They said the Chinese do have religion, which is rather similar to Christianity, and they call it Confucianism, they said. And their king is something like our God, and so on and so forth. And it's only a question of making clear to the Chinese that, of course, Christianity was superior. Then the Dominicans, who hated the Jesuits, for whatever reasons they did, they went and claimed that it is impossible. Confucianism is no religion. In fact, Chinese are a people without a religion. Now, it is a huge problem because, said the Jesuits, if it turns out that there are cultures and groups and people without religion, that would mean that all the church fathers are wrong. In fact, the Bible, under some interpretation, itself would become false. Namely, God planted a sense of divinity in all human beings, in each and every one of us. Then imagine, they said, the chaos. The libertines, the atheists, would simply say, if there are cultures without religion, then they would say Christianity itself is a human invention. So what was at stake then, when they went to China, I'm now talking about the 15th, 16th centuries, was if it turns out that there are cultures without religion, then people would start believing that Christianity is not the word of God, but an invention of busy human beings. And the entire edifice of Christianity would collapse. So when the Muslims, when came to India, they didn't write books, but they did speak about us. They made us into a religion, namely those of us who worshipped shaitan. We, meaning Indians, worshipped the Satan. We were worshipping the images. So there is no wonder, if you like, that before the British came, the Indians also started distinguishing themselves, whether they accepted the word or not, Hindu as against the Muslims. Because the Muslims did distinguish them, and they did belong to a religion, and that religion was a false religion. So it has been my thesis then, is that where people have religion, and they go to another culture, they are compelled, cognitively compelled, to construct and create religions. And these units, I call them experiential units, makes sense because they cannot conceive of. It is not possible to think of a culture without religion. Such is the fascination of this theological claim. It's not a vague assumption. It is a very explicit theological claim. If there were to be cultures without religion, then some of the biblical claims can be traced, can be checked to be true or false. And should that happen, then there is no way it could be the word of God. Now, not everybody is aware of these implications, but such is the mesmerizing charm exerted by this thesis of universality of religion that we have today evolutionary biologists and geneticists trying to trace a biblical theme, mind you, in our biological genes. So they are supporting the so-called scientists, or if you like, empirically proving the truth of biblical claim. So yesterday, when I was a bit angry about these things, it is not that we are criticizing the work of natural scientists, as one of the listeners put it in his blog yesterday, not knowing natural sciences. No, it is a criticism based on natural sciences. We are not dismissing it is not a claim, it's a mere vague hypothesis, which in fact is developed by so-called atheists, but it's not atheism at all. It confirms the fundamental theological claim, namely, there could be no culture there could be no people without a religion. Now, so Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism are constructs in this sense. They are experiential entities. When the British came, when the Europeans come, when the Muslims see, they do see us performing libations and worshipping the stone statue. They do see us indulging in idol worship. They do translate our puja as worship. And of course, if we learn English through our native languages, which is how most of us have learned English, then we are simply taught that puja is worship. And we agree. That means what? You see, worship is a word, even though it's a word at the moment in the English language, and other languages, European languages have equivalent words. It is completely, 100% embedded in a theological framework which says the following. Worship is an act which you can only direct towards God, to nothing else. That is what worship means.